To make real progress, you need momentum. And in this video, I'm going to explain how you can get it. In another video, you learned how to use 80-20 to focus on the few things that gave you the greatest return and to eliminate unnecessary activities in your life and business. Most of the time, however, that's not enough. Doing less of what doesn't matter will give you more time to spend on what does, but even when you do what's most important, you won't make much progress without momentum. Momentum is perpetual motion. It's not one step. Instead, it's the propensity, the natural inclination, what amounts to your personal preference to take the next step and the next one and the one after that. Anyone can take one step, but it takes motivation to get you to take the next one. You have to want to do it, either because of an internal desire or because you've decided that you must. It could be that you take the next step through the sheer force of your will, because in the beginning, that might be the only thing that will get you to do it. Each time you take a step, you start to form a pattern. And that's whether you do so because you want to or because you're making yourself do it. And when that pattern is repeated often enough, then you form a habit. Habits will cause you to continue to take those steps even when you don't feel like it. I know someone who hated his job and who disliked his boss a lot. He didn't like to go to work, but he did so day in and day out because it was a habit. He only changed that habit when I asked him why he was still there. Soon thereafter, he changed jobs. That's the power of a habit. Momentum comes from inside of you. With a habit, you do something because you're used to doing it. Momentum, on the other hand, compels you. The pull to act is internal. You don't have to will yourself to do something, nor does the habit of doing so override your preferences. Instead, you do it because you won't feel right if you don't. Napoleon Hill says that first you get it, that's a habit, and then it gets you, that's momentum. Athletes experience this, and you don't have to be a pro for it to happen to you. They get what is known as a runner's high. I've had it, and I'm the farthest thing from a pro athlete you've probably encountered. First, you exercise because you know you must. You faithfully complete your workout a certain number of times per week. I remember when I started to cycle. The first few months were really hard. I knew I needed to do it, but it required discipline to do it and to keep doing it. The ground was flat, and for the most part, the weather was pleasant. There were no excuses, but I had to will myself to do it. And it was that much harder because there was no one to ride with. It was just me. I still remember when my rides seemed to expand from a mere 5 miles up to 10 or 12. Suddenly I realized that cargo shorts and tennis shoes weren't going to work. I needed to get proper shorts, shirts, and shoes. And something else happened too. I started to look forward to those rides. According to Dr. John Ratey, author of the book Spark, the runner's high, which anyone can get, occurs when your brain is flooded with a mixture of high levels of endorphins, neurotransmitters, endocannabinoids, and a peptide called ANP. It comes from a variety of activities, one of which is intense exercise. The feeling is so strong that you don't feel right unless you work out. Your day feels incomplete if you don't do it, even if it's your rest day. And that's because you crave that feeling. You've become addicted, if I can put it like that, to that chemical brain bath. And so strong is that feeling that you can develop a different problem, the desire to exercise too often. Before athletes become athletes, they had to decide they wanted to become one. That meant they had to practice. At that point, it didn't matter much why they wanted to do so. At first, they had to decide what was required for them to achieve their long-term goal. Then they had to decide which things were most important to them and which ones they would give up. When they knew that, then they started to practice 3, 4, 5 days per week, consistently, like clockwork. With practice came motivation, the motivation to keep at it. This led them to develop the habit of exercise. Eventually, the habit reversed itself. Instead of exercising because it was what they did, a habit, they did it because they didn't feel right if they didn't. That's momentum. They checked the weather all the time, sometimes days in advance, and then planned their other life activities and work around those exercise times. And that's what momentum looks like. Momentum comes from the feeling that you must do something because you won't feel right if you don't. In other words, the absence of it is worse than its presence. Momentum is subject to Newton's laws of motion. The first law says that the speed of an object, you could think of this as a problem that you're trying to solve. The speed of an object will remain at rest. That is, it won't change unless it's compelled to by an outside force. What that means is that if you're trying to fix a problem, whether it's as an entrepreneur, a spouse, a partner, employee, or anything else, that no progress can be made unless you do something to make it happen. You have to exert some kind of force that will move that problem. It will remain exactly as it is if you choose to do nothing. Of course, you're powerless to prevent other people and circumstances outside of your control from acting on the situation. But that just means that you have even more reason to take action than you did before. So the first law is about the problem itself. The second law describes the relationship between the force required in order for change to occur and the speed of that change. In other words, it considers the action you have to take to make progress and how long it will take for that change to happen. Speed is referred to as acceleration. If you want your car to accelerate, then you have to apply more force to the gas pedal. But even when you do, there's a slight delay. In the more powerful cars, you may feel as though the change is instantaneous, but in reality it isn't. There's a slight pause. This may be one reason why a car's speed is calculated in terms of the number of seconds that are required to go from 0 to 60 miles per hour. The rate of acceleration is slower at the beginning and faster towards the end. If you've ever flown, then you'll recall a time when after the plane reached its flight level, the sound of the engines became less. That's because when the plane gets to its cruising speed, then the effort, the energy, if you like, that's required to keep it there compared to what was needed to get it there is less. And so the pilot pulls the throttle back. So the second law is about the force that's required to change the problem. The third law explains why so much force is required in the first place. And you're probably familiar with this one, but haven't really thought about how it applies to you. It says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. In other words, when you apply more force to make something change, there's an unseen force that pushes back against you and which is determined to maintain the status quo that you're trying to overcome. Let's look at an example. Escape velocity. Escape velocity is the speed a rocket must go to break free of gravity. It's about 24,000 miles per hour. Compare that with a Cessna four-seater, a 172, which can take off at around 63 miles per hour. The SR-71 Blackbird is the fastest and highest flying production aircraft ever built. It was designed to cruise at more than 2,200 miles per hour at 85,000 feet, which is just over 16 miles above the surface of the Earth. At that altitude, crew members have to wear what amounts to spacesuits, even though they're well below an orbital altitude. This aircraft has to travel more than 240 miles per hour just to get off the ground. But to get into orbit, it would have to go up another 80 miles and increase its speed by a factor of more than 10 times. These numbers illustrate why so much force is required to make a change, in this case, to escape the Earth's gravity. As long as you're willing to fly within the Earth's atmosphere, the amount of effort is quite small. In other words, less energy is required to maintain the status quo. But when you try to break free from it, then a massive amount of effort has to be expended. And that's because of that equal and opposite reaction that wants to keep you where you are. This is why you fail to get the results that you want. It's because more effort is required to get going than what you expected. And that's because something else is resisting you. If you don't exert sufficient force over time, then you won't gain any momentum. Momentum comes from pushing hard enough for long enough so that movement, rather than inertia, becomes the new normal. It's at that point that these laws of motion actually begin to work for you. And that's why it's a lot easier to stay moving than it is to get moving. Momentum comes from continually moving. It takes a lot of effort over time to get things moving. But once they are, then it's easier to keep it that way than it is to ignore it and then to have to start over. I'm Dr. Bruce Hoag. If you found value in this video, then please like it and subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below. I read them and will answer as many as I can.